So let's get started to set the innovation landscape and share the insights. Please give a warm welcome again to our panel.
Thank you very much, Julianne. To set the scene, normally we would have a short presentation, and Michael had been earmarked to present that presentation, but he said that he would rather do it as a short series of questions and answers from me. So Michael, if you are sitting comfortably, what is innovation?
Paul, innovation is one of those buzzwords around the place. We've had ministers of innovation, we've had workshops on innovation, and colloquially it is often used as novel, original, groundbreaking. But technically, and I guess we are in a sort of policy space here, it's a process by which new outcomes, novel outcomes, economic, social, environmental, are actually realised. It means doing things differently to generate value. Economic, yes, but also social value, environmental value. And that is the process that I think we're talking about today.
So innovation is just R&D?
No. In fact, probably better answer that the opposite way around. Some of the horror of my academic colleagues, R&D is of itself not innovation. It's an important process to do research, but it is not innovation. It can lead to innovation. It can assist innovation because you can actually do research, but it is not of itself innovation. If you want a very simple question of what innovation is, in yesterday's Oz, there is a wonderful picture of two women drinking wine from a glass. In Melbourne, and disappointingly in Melbourne, I hope there are a few restaurants out there, they're serving Hill of Grace and Grange by the nano glass. You can buy, 25 millilitres of Grange at a restaurant. That is innovation.
A shot of Grange. So where does innovation come from?
Where does innovation come from? In a nutshell, unmet needs, community requirements, markets, customers, things that actually do make a difference. In fact, Peter Drucker, over 10 years ago, wrote one of the first analysis of innovation. And on his list of things, R&D, science and technology, ranked 7th. Above it were things like the unexpected, market demand, industry strategies, public perceptions, demographics, etc. Booz does every year, has just produced a survey of the top 1,000 most innovative companies and the top most R&D spenders. The two lists are interesting. You can Google it. There are only 2 companies that appear on the 10 most innovative companies in the world. Now, the metrics for innovation are a bit rubbery, but this is largely around people's perception. Only 2 of the top 10 R&D providers appear on that list. And the 2 are interesting. The 2 on the list are Samsung, who is 3rd on most innovative company and 2nd biggest R&D spender, and Microsoft, which is 7th most innovative company and the 5th biggest R&D spender. Volkswagen is the biggest R&D spender in the world. It's actually been rated the most innovative auto company by the automotive industry. Yet, on the list of the 10 most innovative companies, there's a little company called Tesla that makes electric cars. But why is it innovative? Because its business model is threatening everybody. Cars serviced by distances, no need for dealers, do the whole thing differently. So in a sense, it is that market need, market opportunities which lead to innovation. And R&D can be, or in my example of the wine, probably not very critical, but that's a significant innovation. New outcomes, valued by somebody, and hopefully in that part of the equation, valued for economic purposes, since we have to think about the economic future.
It's interesting because earlier this week, Tesla announced that they were releasing all of their patents.
Yes, they have.
Them available,
they have.
Which
we might want to talk about that
somewhat
a bit later.
radical. Yes, well, yes. Let's get into that. But so what does this say about business?
What it says about business, they need to step up. Recently, one of my hats I wear is on behalf of the Australian Council of Learned Academies, and we've been commissioned by the chief scientist for some studies. One is, he wants some findings for public policy. One of us on the role of R&D in driving Australian productivity, of which innovation is important. And unfortunately, Australian business is not globally competitive. We need business to step up. We need business to think about the markets, to understand their markets, to challenge the R&D community, but on a whole range of metrics, Australian business is not as globally competitive as it needs to be.
And what about the role of unis in innovation? Do we need to worry about that?
Definitely. While I've said that they may not be the biggest driver of innovation, and I personally think that that's true, that's why business needs to lift its game, we do need, particularly in a knowledge-based economy, we do need universities to engage better with industry. Again, the Ecola report points to the fact that in Australia, collaboration between industries and universities is one of the worst in the OECD world. I think there's a little bit too much onus perhaps put back on us and not a challenging discussion. That's a conversation we're going to have this afternoon, Paul, but I think it's also perhaps useful if we just step back a little bit and ask how should that engagement occur? Because I think those different engagement channels, if you like, can be supported or incentivised in different ways. A little too much of the discussion is coloured by the Silicon Valley type idea. There's a brilliant idea in the university, and there's millions of those brilliant ideas that are out there in the university. We've only got somewhere got to get them out. That's one way, commercialisation of IP, new companies coming out, and they lead to certain challenges, some of which were explored in the workshop on venture capital and funding in this series. There is licensing of technology to existing companies. Again, there is a process there, and there's some bottlenecks we can talk about. There's also the transfer of technical capabilities into companies. And then perhaps the most challenging, because I do think it's an area where there is a significant mismatch, is really bringing university expertise and knowledge to assist in solving technical or business or related problems in a company. And the challenge there, it's really operating in a sort of a consultant type mode. And that's, I think, a significant part of what we need to bring. One reason we need to bring that to the table is because every one of you in business that might have a technical problem, you talk to Australian universities, you're talking directly to people who do 3% of the world's R&D. There's 97% of it out there. But we, in the university community, are probably a little better connected to the rest of that R&D community than you might be. So we need to be able to bring that R&D knowledge to the table. Unfortunately, that's not really our core business. There's no, put it bluntly, there's no incentive, there's no value for us to actually do that. Yet we have to find out how we do that through. And finally, where I think we spend too little time talking about it, the most significant contribution we in the universities make to the innovative community of the future are the graduates we send out. And I would like to think, as we will do, if I'm allowed a little bit of a commercial, we will do this evening with a New Venture Institute function in the Hilton to celebrate our Venture Dorm graduates. We need to take our students and help them become innovators themselves. In the famous words of the president of Texas A&M, to make our students job makers, not job takers. So those are the leads, and I think if we take that sort of dissection of the interface, you can see how we might enable each one of those more effectively. So in summary, yes, particularly in a knowledge-based world, we will not get very far without universities. But equally, even if we have that interface perfect, if we get universities transparent, open, and all the things people say we're not, which I actually think we are better than we claim to be, unless we have a community out there that is engaged, and is not engaged as an end user. I hate that word. We need business in the tent now at the beginning of the research to say, oh, that's a bright idea, but if you can make it for 5 cents, great problem. If you make it for $50, no way. We need that discussion. We need that intelligence, and that's not something I think it's very easy for us to do, but we need to get that part of the equation.
Well, you've certainly set plenty for us to talk about and set the scene beautifully. Ladies and gentlemen, can we get a big round of applause, please, for Michael? So let's dive in, and picking up from what Michael was just saying there. Tanya, you're a university, you've got a very successful research institute there. Can you have innovation research without industry partners? You seem to be doing quite well for yourself there.
Look, I I've increasingly come to the view that you can't really build sustainable research excellence without very good partnership. And the reason's pretty simple. In most of the areas where you have strong research, you need, what's critical there is to have critical mass. You need to have enough of a team to really be able to compete internationally in order to succeed and win grants and attract good people. But then you have a dilemma. You need career pathways for the people that come through that system. And if you do it in a completely inward-facing way, solving research problems that you postulate in a pure research sense, you have trouble sustaining true research excellence over a really long period of time. A really vibrant, dynamic leader might be able to do it for 5 or 10 years, but to really establish lasting legacy, you need to build those partnerships. And you know, I was very fortunate in the early stages of my research career to work at the University of Southampton, where they've, for about 40 years now, had real strength and international leadership in the area of optoelectronics. And what does that mean? Well, it means an ecosystem where you have everything from numerous startups to big companies attracted to the area because of that critical mass of research. And you don't have all the young postdoctoral researchers and students thinking that their one aim in life is to become the professor. They think success is going out and working for some of these amazing companies in the local environment. So in my view, really strong research requires partnership. Depending on the field, that might be industry, it might be different in different areas. But I think that's what we need to be striving for. And it means that, in some sense, not all research areas are equal, you know, and we need to be creating research capacity in areas where industry cares.
It sounds like you're describing a seedbed for a whole smart economy. That can grow out of that model of a research institute with these feed-in companies.
Absolutely, yeah. You are, and you know, you can get a pretty good health check actually on such a research capacity by just trawling through the labs and seeing whether you have people from companies working in there and students from those labs working in companies. And you know, the international angle is an interesting one because you don't really get a chance to engage strongly internationally unless you are at that cutting edge of research. And it's difficult in the current climate in most areas, particularly in the science and technology areas, to be at the cutting edge of research unless you have critical mass. So it's all intertwined.
Anthony, do we have a culture of innovation and entrepreneurship here in South Australia? Have you noticed one?
I think if I said yes, we might as well pack up and go home. We haven't got a problem.
Okay, then what's lacking?
So I think the answer is that you know, we have the green shoots of an innovation culture here, entrepreneurial culture here in South Australia. But I don't think we actually have a culture, because I don't think every day we wake up and we live and breathe that innovation culture. So Michael's pointed out some of the problems that you know, business needs to stand up more. We need to do more investment in R&D. I think we need to have much more of a learning culture within our organisations so that we have utilised the great graduates that we produce to really stimulate commercialisation activities in South Australia. So I think that where the answers no around that question is around culture, because I think that's what, if South Australia is going to improve in the next 5 to 10 years, it's got to become part of our DNA. Because at the moment, if you benchmarked us against the rest of the world, I'm sure we're going to fall well down the ranks.
Just looking out across this audience, mostly business people, how many of your companies, how many of you are with organisations that have an innovation relationship with a university or some other institution? Any of you engaged in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6? Okay, would one of you care to comment on what that relationship is? Let's see. So what is your relationship with innovation?
Yes, so my name is Silvia Estrada and I am Program Manager for the Competitive Foods Initiative in South Australia. It is an industry association. It is the big industry association. We have about 270 members. It is a mixture of about 70% food manufacturers and 30% service providers, like robotics, automation, marketing, all sorts of consultancy businesses. And we mostly deal with SMEs because, as you know, at least in terms of food manufacturers, 83% of our food manufacturers here in SA are SMEs. So my role is specifically to connect these SMEs to opportunities in terms of grants, programs, initiatives that connect the industry with innovation. And I'm not limited really to see what universities or research organizations are providing. One recent example is we actually carried out a workshop with Mondelez International, and this is in Ringwood in Victoria. They have a center, it's a food innovation center led by Mondelez with support of the Victorian government. So this is available to all manufacturers. We are engaging with them to develop a platform of access to the facilities they have. They have 3D printing, they have advanced prototyping, something that we don't have here. So that's essentially what I do.
Just curious, to take a crude summary of Michael's rather erudite description of innovation, it's identifying problems and providing solutions to it.
Yes.
What are the key problems that have driven innovation for you?
In food manufacturing, the main issues right now are labor. Of course, labor costs are increasing for our food manufacturers. Reuse of byproducts and waste is the second one. Essentially, purchase of materials, raw materials, is the highest cost element in the profit and cost structure of our food manufacturers in Australia. So anything that tackles waste, anything that tackles labor, those two big ticket items will definitely help the industry. And this is where we are focusing our efforts.
Thank you very much. Can we get a round of applause there, ladies and gentlemen? And before we come back to the panel, most of the audience did not put their hands up when they said that they are not working for organisations that are involved in innovation. Would someone care to comment why? Are there distinct hurdles that you can identify that prevent you or your organisation being involved in innovation? We have a volunteer down the front here.
Just separating the two versions of your question. So the first version of your question was an innovation relationship with the university.
Yeah.
The second was who are involved in innovation.
Okay, yeah.
So I run a couple of companies, both who are intensely involved in innovation, and they're my fifth and sixth startups.
Right.
Neither of them have an innovation relationship with the university, and that's more, I think, where the problem lies. And that's because essentially universities are impenetrable to business. They work in a different way, they talk a different language, and I've taken the time over the last 3 years to understand that language to a higher degree. But I think one of the reasons why that happens, as Michael hit upon, there's no incentive for a university to innovate. In actual fact, innovating for a university is a waste of effort, because innovation stops you from getting papers out, it stops you from teaching students, and they're the only two things that there are incentives for universities to do.
I think you've just let the cat amongst at least two pigeons to my left. Pigeon number one, Tanya, you're itching to make a comment on that.
I've been called pigeon number one. I'll cherish that. I guess I'll just make two brief comments. The first comment, you're spot on around incentives. Absolutely spot on. The majority of our research capacity within Australia and within South Australia has active disincentives to engagement. That's one aspect. On the more positive side, and I think the comment from the lady at the back brought it front and centre to my mind again, the cases where I'm starting to see it working, where the green shoots analogy is a nice one, is where there is effort in building relationships in sectors and areas where you can build a common language rather than across the whole sector as a whole. So, you know, there's a couple of nice examples in our state. You talked about the food one. We have the medical device partnering program at Flinders. We have the photonics catalyst program in my institute, where the focus is connecting business in one sector to capability where we have strength. You know, there you can actually start to realise what the language barriers are and get out and start to build knowledge around that. So I agree, you're absolutely right, the settings are wrong, and I think we need to seriously look at what can we change to improve these settings. And I think part of the onus is on universities, and I'm not saying all universities are the same, but it is a very common problem. And part of it is potentially a role for government in trying to help with that.
Pigeon number 2?
No, I mean, I think Marty's comment about interpenetrability is to some extent relevant, although Anthony once said in a forum, you'll probably deny this, Anthony, said pick up the phone, call Flinders, but there is a sense through, and in fact, sitting to your right, I wouldn't mind teasing a comment out from John, because John comes from NanoConnect, which is another one of these enterprises like medical device partnering that Tanya talked about, which essentially tries to tunnel through this barrier. And it might be just interesting if, putting you on the spot, just rather than me answering it, you give a comment in that space, John.
Over to you, John.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. John Campbell from the Nanotechnology Centre at Flinders. I guess I would agree with your comments about difficulty in getting through to university, and we have the same problem going out to industry and trying to find people that are interested in doing, I guess, problem solving. We don't come from a research outwards mentality. We try and go to companies and say, what are your problems? How can we help? How can nanotechnology do something? And often the work that we do is not high science, it's not research. It's just simply applying some scientific method and some knowledge that's locked up within the university to the problem. I guess I would probably pose a question at this point about how you think we can improve that process. How do we get out there more effectively to companies and find people that we can work with and are willing to tell us their problems, tell us their ideas for the future, and see where we can add value.
And I'd like to bring that actually back to you, Anthony. There was a voucher system here in South Australia that was supposed to do exactly that, to help facilitate innovation and working with universities. How did that go? Tell us that story.
Well, I'm probably not the most expert person on that, except obviously we took up the opportunity to utilise it. So it enabled companies to identify a piece of work that a problem they were looking to solve, and then to engage with a research institution to help them solve that particular problem. Whether it really had the desired effect of generating the innovation level that we're looking for, I guess that's something for the creators of the program to answer. I think John's right in terms of that engagement with the university and then the business in terms of solving the problem. So in our company's case, we're heavily involved in research with the University of Wollongong. Whilst I have a great relationship with the universities in South Australia, and we certainly employ many of the students, when we did a body of work and identified who's the best organisation for us to work with based on our technology sector. So it's very important that like any supplier that you want to work with, that you really match up, are they the right company to work, or organisation to work with us. So back in about 2002, 2003, there was a government program at the time called TechFast. It was a $5,000 voucher, and an employee of that organisation would look around all the universities in Australia and New Zealand based on, they came in and did an audit of your business. What's the 3 top technologies that you think can take your company to the next level? And then they went out and looked at those technologies around the universities and said, we think here's some likely partners. And at the time, I think it was Curtin University and University of Wollongong. That was back in 2002, 2003. Our relationship with the University of Wollongong today is is still alive and growing. And a small company like ours investing roughly around 50K each year on research that we're thinking is 5 to 10 years in terms of application. But our technology roadmap needs to look 10 years in advance. So, it's that conduit of how you can build that relationship. And And universities are daunting places if, you know, once you've been a student there and left for a while and you go back and you think, wow, how do I ever negotiate my way around this place? There's no sign that says open for business. So it's all about the connections, it's all about the relationships. And, you know, Tanya's been one in South Australia, I know, that's so on the front foot about building that relationship.
Oh, she's everywhere.
She is. But that's what you need to do. And so, you know, every university needs someone like Tanya that's out there knocking on business doors saying, you know, how can we help you solve this problem? How can we help you do this? Or, wow, we've got this great piece of work. We think you'd be a great partner to commercialise it. It's got to be that supplier-customer relationship. You've got to work together.
Michael, just reading between the lines on this problem of accessing university engagement for innovation, it sounds to me like it's at least in part an extension of the problem that science talks a different language to business. They run at different time frames, and bringing those into synchrony so that they can have a dialogue is at the heart of it. And to follow on from the point that you made earlier, recasting innovation as a business proposition, the solution of problems for your business, is that going some way to becoming the Babel fish, the way of interpreting between science, research and business?
I think the sort of description that Anthony had, John's contribution of these tunnels between the communities, is an important part of the exercise. But nevertheless, every organisation in the end is actually driven by some key drivers. And I can't apologise for the fact, in fact, to put it bluntly, where we are likely to go in higher education in the future is potentially to make it more difficult to do these things. Because, to put it bluntly, the resources we acquire are done for two purposes. We are funded to teach students, we are funded to do research. And most of that research is blue sky research. And therefore, the metrics are, yes, publish, yes, you know, sort of get your research grants, evaluated by schemes of which there are more and more. You can puncture through that. UK, 20 years ago, was in much the same state as we were, that essentially it was too academic, if you liked. A very little bit of money was put through the system in the UK called third stream funding. It was designed to enhance those interactions. You know, you could say to us, we should do more things like Supply John, or the program that Tanya's got, or Medical Device Partners. I don't know whether Karen Reynolds has managed to get online from New Zealand. Those programs are very important parts, but they have to be enabled by the state government with a little bit of extra money to make that actually happen. Because otherwise we have to divert limited resources, and all the indications are that Australian universities globally do not have much fat in the system. So again, you come to this question that yes, we'd like to change it all, but you've got to find it. So my view is the more we have of these sustainable little punching through the walls that go in various ways, your description of TechFast, your engagement of those things, to open up those conversations, to keep feeding back new information into the system is what we need to do in Australia. We've got people from, you know, the automotive industry or the ex-automotive industry here in South Australia. They might like to reflect upon where innovation flows in that particular system and to what extent challenging problems are actually fed out to be engaged, or we just supply parts at cheap aspect. Those issues need to be brought back onto the table. So I think it is punching through, keeping it going, engaging more people, and we do need a little bit of resource to do it.
So that does bring in, if you like, the third partner in innovation, that is the government and their role in supporting, opening those doors, making those relationships.
Two quick answers from me on that. One I've talked about, second is procurement. Procurement, supporting local companies, new opportunities is a far from, what's the word I want? It is a great opportunity to help support new companies here in South Australia, innovative companies, build our capacity. We do a lot of building in this country. We should be making sure we've got little things. I'm very proud of the fact that we're putting solar panels on a number of our buildings. It'll be a relatively big project over time, and we've given a contract very fairly, very squarely through a tough tender process to Tinto Solar, a local company, an innovative little company. It's actually working with the Nanoscale Centre, I believe, but it's a great time of where we did it. I sit on the Southern Adelaide Economic Development Board, and I believe around the desal plant there was very little engagement with local companies. I think that is something where government can do a lot more without corrupting the tender process, but much we have to use every straw we've got to drive innovative companies, challenge them to supply new products, and then they challenge us.
Professor Monro, you have a story for us.
Well, I just want to tell a little story that I thought might actually really help us really understand this. So these tunnels we talk about, right? They get around this, who do I talk to in certain areas? They're not a solution to all problems. But I'm just going to tell a little story about one of the first projects that have kicked off with this Photonics Catalyst program, because I think it illustrates what we're up against, but also how bright the hope is. One of the first projects that's been awarded under this is a partnership between the brightest young researcher that I've ever had the pleasure to supervise as a PhD student and a local smelter that are looking to be able to very accurately measure temperature in molten metals so that they can have much more efficient energy use. It's a very practical problem. It'll have a huge impact. And, you know, we went through a process for selecting which of the proposals that came up were most merit bearing, and you know, this young researcher, he wowed everyone by not only having a good idea and actually came in with a demonstrator and a blowtorch and showed us it working, right? It's quite amazing. Now, the fascinating thing was a lot of the hurdles had been overcome here. The partnering had been done, the end user had specified the problem, a potential solution had been put forward. And yet, what happened in some of those early dialogues? Well, the postdoc said, when asked by the industry partner, how long is it going to take to get this out? His response was, I think it's going to take 2 or 3 years of research. Now, I know what he was saying is, actually, I don't know how I'm going to package this. But he didn't know how to say that. I know that sounds simple, but he didn't know how to say that. What he was saying in a researcher's language is, I'm not quite sure what I'm going to have to do to make this into a package, right? But the industry partner was terrified and almost left, because they thought, I can't wait 3 years. If I can't do something in a few months, I haven't got a business case. So it's about having someone who can catch that conversation and provide a bit of education to the researcher and a bit of cultural context to the industry so they understand what each other is saying. And I just thought,
what was the result?
The end result is that, you know, we in the research field often, because we're problem solvers and question askers, we often take on problems that are not our own and give a Rolls-Royce gold-plated solution to a problem the industry didn't have in the first place. So, you know, essentially, no, but, you know...
Over-innovation.
Well, you know, often, you know, we need to really make sure we understand what the end user wants and be much more explicit in our language around why we say, when we say 2 or 3 years, what we're talking about. Okay. You know, it's, yeah.
I'd like to go back to the audience now, particularly those who say that their company is not involved in innovation at the moment. Let's go back to that definition given to us by Michael about identifying problems and solving them. How many of you have a problem that could potentially be solved through an innovative relationship with someone else? Yeah? Now, would anybody like to actually speak to what those problems are? Do I have to volunteer someone? So, I mean...
Can I make a comment there?
Yeah.
Because it might tease that out. One of the important aspects of having that conversation, and where in a sense Tanya's right and Anthony's right about building relationship over time, is trust. Because to make that a valuable conversation, you need to be able to get behind the veil. There's no point in talking in abstract. Yes, you can do that through signing NDAs and non-disclosure agreements and other sorts of bits and pieces, but somehow we have to find a way of which trust is enough for things to be potentially told to that researcher which will have commercial value. So I think we have to recognise again, there are things on the business side, very legitimate, very important, but but we have to find out how to, in fact, enable that thing to do. I'm interested in the comment that came back from your comment about the food industry, because I think there's an interesting space there that aggregating across those sectors are some potential what I call grand challenges. Challenges that could be put out to the industry, put out to the research community, potentially facilitated by a little bit of enabling money, which might be a better use of the voucher scheme. This is at its greatest thing is in America with an agency called DARPA, which is the Defence Advanced Research Projects Agencies. They put big challenges out. You know, build a magnetometer to stick in a helicopter that can pick up Taliban in the wilds of Bora Bora or something like that. And so the research community is often facilitated to make prototypes to try and solve these problems which stretch the frontiers of current technology and therefore become exciting opportunities for researchers. But it's a different way of energising that relationship. And so that's trying to find that combination of how can we really understand your business opportunity without blabbing it to the press or saying, well, you know, putting out a press statement, I'm going to do these things, which I always hate, press statements of those sorts. But that's, I think, a part of the cultural match that we've really got to sort of work through.
So who here would think about going down the innovation pathway if those relationships were clearer, if you knew how to get into a relationship with a problem solver?
I think the conversation is very passive. You're talking about solving problems. In other words, the university is sitting there saying, we're wonderful, we've got all this capability, come and talk to us and we'll do that. You know, in the three stages of, say, business cycle, first of all you have a product, then you have a service, and I think that's where the universities are, and then you have a solution. Can we have a conversation about, are universities able to work out what their capabilities are, and then do a little bit of work as to where that might be of use, and then go and talk to the companies and say, you have to do some research, some work to know what these companies are about, and say, you know, with this nano stuff, we can make this disappear or whatever. But just sitting and waiting. The other conversation that I think we only just touched on was the timescales involved. The perception in the business community is that if you talk to people in academia, then it's a couple of years away. In this state, we only have 348 companies that employ more than 200. They're the ones that might have the ability and the cash flow, the balance sheet, to be able to wait 2 years. But the other 45,000 that employ between 0 and 200 may not have that. And so how do we have a conversation about getting that, that time scale?
Okay, Tanya, I think that you would want to challenge the idea that you're passively waiting there for people to bring their problems to you. You actually are quite aggressive at getting out there, are you not?
Oh, look, we're out there. We're certainly out there. I think that's perhaps the fault of the language we've been using. I think there are a lot of researchers who are out there making partnerships, and I actually say in a really positive sense, I think it's a huge asset in our state. When I look at my counterparts all over Australia, I don't know anywhere else that's quite as networked as South Australia. I mean, the funniest story I can tell you that a few people may have heard before, but you know, I was talking to someone in broad, loose terms about something I was doing with DSTO, which led to a project with the wine industry, and we now have a bunch of sensors in barrels at Yalumba, which then led to a project with an IVF company. And that was all because of conversations within South Australia. So, you know, we are out there, we're networked.
Wine and fertility and photonics, a great combination.
It's a great combination. But the answer I wanted to give to that timescales one, more I do this, the more I think the reason we have this deserved bad press for poor timelines working with unis is because traditionally people tend to come in through the professor or the senior academic. I think that's where mentored, supported early career researchers are the workforce we should be utilising, because they're ambitious, they don't have the loads of, running large labs or teaching schedules or the longer timelines that more senior academics have. And if you have someone that's, within a year or two of their PhD and they're desperately trying to, start up a really successful career and win fellowships and get prestigious jobs, they're the people who want to show success in delivering on an industry project. And they've got the time to do it.
Anthony, the timeline problem, is it a deal killer?
Definitely not. I mean, I think you've got to be realistic. There's technology can go and buy off the shelf, and you can put that in say 1 to 3 years. But there's innovation that is groundbreaking that can take 1 to 3 years or 1 to 10 years, depending on the complexity of the challenge. So I think if you have a good project management system, and as Tanya says, it's outlined to you up front, look, these are the steps we're going to take. We can't just jump from there to there in a couple of minutes. This is the steps we're going to take, and we're going to keep you closely informed, and at each stage you'll get a report, or we'll engage with you. More often than not, the company says, okay, well, we're happy to participate. It's when you start the project, and 3 years later you haven't had a report, you don't know what's going on, it's just sort of meandering around. That's when companies get frustrated.
Michael, the question arises out of the expectation of what partners are going to get out of an innovative relationship. Particularly things like IP. Who's going to own any IP that comes out of trying to solve a specific problem? How important is it to, up front, plan ahead and figure out how you're going to divvy up the goodies at the other end of a successful relationship?
I'm one of the people in this country that believe we've spent a vast amount of effort on both sides of this fence, spending a lot of time, including a lot of legal expenses, debating how we divide up nothing. And I saw Rob in the back, and I could shoot these commercial managers along the line. Anthony's put his finger on it to a certain extent, as you did, around expectations. And I think, like every project, you do need a bit of upfront thinking. And interestingly, the question of IP is more about the question of what will happen if we make a bonanza, or what will happen if we just add value to an existing company. And so again, part of the way on a company side, and I do recognise Nick's comment about small balance sheets, small companies, and that's why I think consortia of networks and things are important. In the end, the simplest way to get, if you've got a technical problem that has a chemist available to solve it and you want it solved in a month, you know what the simplest way to do that? And you happen to know there's a good organic chemist? Walk in and buy that guy or gal for a month. And then you've got them, and you probably don't need to pay KPMG consulting rates, but you could pay a little bit. And you might be amazed at what you get, because our colleagues are very accessible, always like a little bit more money to do things, and you've got at hands someone doing things for it. If you do it for a postdoc, that's good, because it's a great opportunity, they've got time to do it. Do it for PhD students. Do it for some interns. Great way of bringing some talent into it, manage around those particular projects. So I think there are different ways to approach these problems, but certainly one of the recommendations I'm going to make out of this workshop is we do something about making IP disappear out of this equation until we have a big bonanza, and then we'll all have a great fun of celebrating how we make $1 million out of it.
Tanya, there's a lot of IP generated out of your unit, so you happy to kiss that goodbye for the time being, or how do you handle IP creation?
Anything we can do to get rid of the hurdles would be good. Honestly, anything we can do to
That's really going to require a huge degree of trust, though.
Yeah, but if you look at the motivation of why people end up being scientists and researchers, you do it because you want to make a difference. And in reality, once you've lived through a few negotiations, you lose the will to live, and you wonder why and the feeling of getting something out, that's what you're doing it for, and it builds that trust, and it comes back to you because, ultimately, we want universities where innovative people who are good at partnering do really well out of it and then give back to their universities. That's what we want. I mean, for our universities to sit, to in any way block that actually probably has greater consequences for the lack of philanthropy that will come down the line. So I honestly think the more we can do to liberate IP, the better.
And just bring that into a South Australian context for us, if you wouldn't mind, Anthony. Do you see much of this horse trading around things like IP and ownership of any of the benefits that come out of it?
Certainly, I think we've been on both sides. We've been on the side that never wants to work with a university again because the sandstone that they're built out of is their approach to IP sharing. It just doesn't happen. In fact, we were approached by a university out of Sydney, and they said, "We'd like if you could offer some final year engineering projects." And we said, "Sure, we've got actually 2 or 3 that we could offer." So then they sent an agreement saying that you sign off all your IP. I'm thinking, hang on, you asked me about a project. Well, that's a very simple, but obviously they didn't get the final year projects. We'd rather work with Flinders or the South Australian universities. But we've also had similar experiences in South Australia, and I think ultimately it comes back to the personalities that you're dealing with and the flexibility in the negotiations. So if you've got someone like Michael who says, look, just go in and hire that PhD student for a month and get what you need, that's fine. Or let's sit down and do an agreement where we can co-share or we'll license it. You have to have flexible approaches like you do in business.
But see, that's the win-win I want, because I want our students and our postdocs more industry savvy, more employable by industry, more pathways there, so it's a win-win.
Horses for courses. So just look at the situation and say, look, are we really worth arguing over IP on a project that's going to be worth X? Rather than here's a bigger picture, then let's put that aside and get on with the bigger, what's really going to help South Australia.
Just extending this question of IP, Michael, the University of New South Wales has taken a rather interesting approach with respect to IP over the patents that it already holds. And essentially what they describe is the problem with the universities holding patents is they're in an elephant hunt. They're all waiting for the big one that's going to, make the university endowed for 1 million years. And they've got all of these small patents which they're sitting on that are not doing anything. And so therefore, why not throw open your books and invite people to come in at a much lower level of commitment, a much smaller turnover, to actually benefit from that IP creation?
Well, there's a little bit of a misconception there, which I think even applies to the University of New South Wales. To my knowledge, Australian patents are relatively few that are fully owned by universities. In fact, most of the issues have been that we have taken patents out to take them forward because there's an industry partner involved, and often because the project's gone through in various ways. That said, though, I do actually think it's not unreasonable for us to adopt the easy IP solution that was around Europe, that we will license it pretty simply to a company with a couple of conditions. If you make a South Australian company, one, you use it. If you don't use it, it comes back. And secondly, I'd put the view to South Australian companies, you do it, and as part of the subsequent work you're doing, you talk with us about the skill sets, the consulting, the capability of the students that actually enable that to go forward, so we generate some jobs for Australia. So, I think out of this, Rob, we might have a challenge coming down from the governor on those lines, and I think we should embrace it with spades and try and get this nonsense off the table, because I think it's unnecessary. It distracts us from the big business. In fact, Stanford's really interesting. Last time I looked at Stanford, they make more money from licensing the Stanford logo than they do from any invention except 2.
We have a contribution down the front here. Can we...
Ian Sterling. I just want to shift the conversation a little bit if I can, because we've been focusing on universities and they're important components of the system of innovation. But a lot of businesses innovate on a continuing basis. Their whole aspect of the future is, how do I innovate what I do? It mightn't be as formally done as through the university system. But I just I just don't want us to lose that part. And it picks up a little bit on what Nick was saying earlier. You know, the 45,000 smaller businesses in South Australia can't afford in a lot of cases to do this. But they are incrementally innovating, and it's about the culture that's in the company rather than a process that's imposed. It's about them developing a way of thinking that says we always have to improve our product and service, and in every incremental way that is an innovation. It's just not a big breakthrough innovation, which is to some extent what we've been talking about up to now, I think. And I'd just like to put that on the table more than anything.
Am I correct in assuming that if I ask you nicely, you would have an example that you could present to us? You don't have to name names, but I'd be interested to hear of this sort of innovation, that kind of grassroots in-house innovation.
Well, I actually reward my people for coming up with innovations. So part of their bonus payment that they can achieve every year is about innovations in both processes, designs. I run an infrastructure company that has 150 engineers working for it, and they are, you know, guys who just love doing something better. The problem is not all of them want to do it for a price, right? They just like doing it. So in a sense, they're like researchers without, you know, having formal qualifications. So they continually try to improve what we do, and largely in our case, it's either to improve the service for customers or to drive costs out of the business. Now companies do that all the time. It's just that it's not crystallised in the sense that we're talking today, but it is part of the culture. And I think innovation, to have an innovative, you know, company, you have to have a culture of doing that within your company.
How do we foster that in-house innovation culture in this state? Are there ways that we can reward companies for
Ian's put his finger right on the issue, and the studies that go back to the carbon report of a decade ago, work by Roy Green, the latest Acola point, is that the number of companies who actually think that culture, that desperately look to drive down their costs, to encourage their staff to see it, are far too few in this country. It doesn't mean they need to research out to universities, although again I think we need a bit of transparency. Some of your guys could be throwing wonderful projects back. That's the challenge. I think part of the answer has to lie with the business community about bringing in new mentors, bringing in new companies. Little startup companies get to a point where they need to think about risk management. A decade ago, CEDA published a report called Innovation. It's still a relevant read, a depressing read, because it talks about the missing skill sets in this space. It talks about risk management and sophisticated risk management and that culture is to be embedded in every sort of company along the lines. And so my challenge is to people like Ian and the rest of the leadership, is particularly to SMEs, how do you actually get out there, train them, lift them up, change their thing? Marty, you know, talk to little companies. How do you do that? And that's, I think, the critical part of the mix.
Just while we're coming back to Marty, with respect to whether it's in-house innovation or it's an innovative collaboration, where there's universities, where there's government involved, etc., where's the driver for innovation? Is it the marketplace? And is that where it should lie? Or should we expect some role from government, for example, to push innovation? And Anthony, you take that one if you wouldn't mind.
Thank you. The drivers, the business owners and the global challenge that we face, we're not competing against each other in South Australia or against each other in Australia. We're competing against, you know, the companies in the US or in Europe or South America, wherever it might be, in Asia. So that's the driver for us. And you know, you can't be satisfied with the status quo. You have to have a culture and a group of people working for you that when they come to work tomorrow, they want to have a landscape that looks totally different than what it did today. And that has to come from the top. You have to have the tools and you have to have the learnings and then the skill sets And as owners, we have to invest. Because if we expect our people to do it on a shoestring, we won't reinvest into new automation and things like that, you're not going to foster innovation. I'm sure if those ideas that you get from those 150 engineers, continually they say, well, why tell him he doesn't bother? You know, he doesn't listen to us. But you know, that's the part of the culture, is that when you get those ideas, you have to foster them and put them into action. And look, ultimately, you won't be here tomorrow if you don't. You know, there's over the last couple of years, how many companies have gone to the wall because they weren't innovating. As soon as the competition got tougher, the market dried up, suddenly they're exposed. So that's the driver.
Okay, we got a camera down here on Marty. Off you go.
So I think that I was going to sort of try and bring things back away from the universities as Ian's done. I think the facet of the story, you asked for a story, I had a very interesting one. I've been dealing with the Department of Industry, formerly Department of Innovation, and their head of policy. I caught up with in a Qantas club one day, and I was talking to her about my businesses, and she said, so which university did these ideas come from? And I said, they came from here. So I think that this is one of the things that's perhaps been missing, is an awful lot of innovation happens in an instant, and you know, it's driven by an invention, driven by a creation that you then have to turn into reality. The cultural part, the reason I think why culturally, the biggest reason why I think culturally we don't get as far as we should in South Australia is because we're so risk averse. So it is much easier for me to raise money for my companies outside of South Australia than it is locally.
Okay.
So yeah, and I think also that the companies that we have here, the culture is almost like it's better to have failed doing what you do than have taken a punt.
Are we too conservative in South Australia?
Yes, absolutely.
Actually, let's take that as a bit of an audience poll. Is that the general feeling, that in South Australia we're too conservative? Hands up. That it's just about right. That maybe we should be more conservative. No, okay. So we've got an adventurous audience to play with. So how do we tap into that? How do we, if there is the interest in being more creative, taking more risk, but that's not happening in South Australia, where's that mismatch? How do we get around that?
One idea that I think is we should tell the failures en route to success. I don't know anyone who's succeeded at anything without falling over a few times, but you don't hear that.
It's like the quote I came across today was, I've had many failures in life and they've been so good I plan to have a few more. Sorry, if we can come here and then we'll go up the back. Yeah.
I think you should reframe the question of whether or not we're risk averse to the people who are actually putting their own money on the line, rather than those that are exhorting others to take the risk.
Okay.
I mean, that's only a rhetorical question, but it's always easy
I'll
to
give
say
you a rhetorical
you should
answer.
take. Sorry, Trevor. You should take the risk, but oh no, don't include me.
Yeah, yeah. I'll take that as a comment. Down the back.
Thanks, Andrew Lunig. So just perhaps we've been talking a lot about technical innovation and process innovation, but perhaps just building on what Marty and Ian were talking about. I work in the area of business models, and I'm seeing that we're getting disruption as much from business models, and certainly young, agile companies, even the sort of $100 startup, assembling sort of capable companies almost like with bits of Lego, from the workforce to the technology to the systems. So I'd just be interested in the panel's observations about the role of business model innovation.
I'll jump in there, because it really, in what I said earlier, I think is as critical, if not more so, than the technical side. Let me ask you the following question. The most innovative company, or the second most innovative company, since the first one is Apple, the second most innovative company is Google, a massive company, massive cash flow. You're allowed one answer to this question. What is the single thing that turned Google into the company today? And just to take search off the table, turned it from an ordinary search company to a great search company. You're allowed one answer. What one thing made it the company it is today?
I know the answer.
You know, I've told you this, Nick. The rest of it, Nick excluded. Anyone in Flinders is also excluded. What's the one thing? Your business model. How do you make money out of search? Pay on click. At the time that Google put its first algorithms out, there were algorithms in CSRO. So why do we Google and don't Panoptic? And at the time, probably it was a good piece of technology. It's because of pay on click. So you're right, the business model, I think, is very, very underestimated, particularly in a service economy where delivering value, something new, some experience is a critical part of the mix. And if you think that doesn't apply to manufacturing, think again. Boeing makes planes. Wrong. Boeing sells a service system that runs through. Why did Airbus know where Malaysia went? Because it was tracking the planes for servicing remotely. So it's all about services, that value, that's the business model. How do you make business model out of what you do?
Did you want?
Yeah, I think South Australia is doing some wonderful things that I think we don't publicise enough. And if you go to a website, adelaide.majoradistillery.com, and look at their entrepreneurial ecosystem map, and you look at the organisations that are in that space, there's 80 startups, 4 accelerators, 3 incubators, 2 co-working spaces, 7 investor groups, 8 consulting organisations, and 1 hackerspace group. So that's in South Australia. I mean, what proportion of our population even though could name one of those organisations? And I'd say very few. Hopefully most of us in this room can, but the majority don't. And so I think there's this, the opportunity to promote some of these young organisations, and a lot of these are doing business model innovation, with app development and all these sorts of things at Majoran or in the hub co-working space. So we're not that bad. We've got those green shoots. What we need to do is foster that and promote those young people that are doing amazing things.
Part of the Shaping the Future of SA series of events that are being held by CEDA is to conclude with some poignant observations from the panellists. 3 things that you would like to see as action points coming out of today's discussion. Tanya, what 3 things would you nominate to see innovation prosper and cultivate that innovation culture in South Australia?
Okay. I'd like to see us partnering our PhD students and early career researchers with industry so they can learn how to break that divide down. I'd like to see us people do what's measured, and you wouldn't believe the impact counting citations on papers has had on the whole research community. We need a T index, a translation index that people can perform to get promotions, to get jobs, to get fellowships. And I'd really think we need to build these tunnels a bit broader. I think we're starting to do quite well in terms of connecting, but we need to then empower some of the commercial benefits that'll come out of those. And some of it will be about taking a bit of a risk and bringing together communities of investors to start to take some of those ideas through. And I think that's what we need to do.
Anthony, your 3 action points from our discussion this afternoon.
Well, I think I just touched on one, and that's that promotion of this South Australian ecosystem around entrepreneurship and innovation. I think that's absolutely number 1 for me. I think number 2 is around the tunnel that Tanya's talking about, and that's, what sort of things can we be doing to get a bunch of commercialisation guys like Rob Chalmers at the back there, business owners, managers and researchers in a room and understand, look, there's a piece of technology that's sitting idle at Flinders or at Adelaide, and how can we take that and adapt it to to solve a new problem? Because I think it's like you go back and you sift through these ideas and you suddenly say, wow, I could apply that here. And I think there's got to be some gems out there that we can tap into. So it's that ability to create the linkages between the companies, the unis and the commercialisation arms. I think we need to work harder at that. And I guess the other thing is just encouraging younger people at school to think about entrepreneurship and innovation as a great career path. That'd be my 3 things.
And Michael, your 3 action points.
I mean, everyone knows I'm Vice Chancellor. The first thing is give me more money, but no. I am going to be a little Vice Chancellorial because I actually have 5. But the reason I've got 5 is I just want to echo 2. And quite important.
That's innovative.
2. I'm allowed 5. I'm also a sponsor of this forum, so I'm allowed 5. On universities, I think I just want to add a Christmas to what is said. I do think we ought to come out of this, and I think we ought to seriously say, can we actually cut through this bottleneck around IP? Can we go to some open, easy access IP? Without a doubt about that. On the business side, I think the mentoring of and I think the question we only touched on briefly is procurement. We ought to come out of this with a clearer statement around government procurement in driving things forward. I'd like to foster the idea of challenges, a forum that comes back, which just amplifies a little bit on that view. The 2 new ones I really want to sort of just put on the table because I think they're important. One is a little parochial, perhaps for Flinders, but it's not for Flinders, it's for South Australia. In the US at the moment, there are things which are called emerging ideas of innovation precincts, relatively small parts of town where the community, the business and education come together. We have a microcosm of that in the South. We need a story in this state about conversion, and I think there ought to be a reiteration of the value proposition for Tonsley. There needs to be an urgency to the friends I saw here from Dimitra about us delivering that thing. There are people here in the business community around that. That's a real live opportunity of us gluing the community, the business and things together. Doesn't mean we don't do other bits and pieces, but it's a real crystal thing. And then finally, without a doubt, we should celebrate success. And in particular, we should celebrate success. We should reach out to our younger people and celebrate their successes. As I said with a little bit of commercial earlier around what we're going to do tonight under the New Venture Institute function. That's the future of South Australia. That's the companies not of today but of tomorrow. And in the process, if we do that, I think there's a great future for this state.
Ladies and gentlemen, it has been quite a wide-ranging discussion. I think there's a lot of food for thought there for the future. Would you please thank my 3 very talented panellists?